An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Greetings, everyone who may be watching this Dharma talk, and I do know that folks watch the Dharma talks. It's been reported to me that we get visits on our YouTube channel on our ongoing offerings of Dharma and during this time of COVID, year 2. And I just wanted to say that I'm grateful to know that you're out there and that we have ways of being connected. And I encourage us to continue to reach out virtually and stay connected virtually, even though there's something subtly dissatisfying about virtual connection. But since it's our only recourse right now, if we want to stay connected, it's kind of essential. And so let us bear with it. And I share a longing. I assume you have a longing for this to change. And I share that. I have the longing for the time where we're gathered together again in the Zendo, where we can sit physically with one another and look into our actual non-virtual eyes of each other, chant together, have tea together, and have exchange, question and answer discussion, as well as a presentation of Dharma. So may that day come post haste. I have been talking about the notion of return in spiritual traditions, in Zen, and also in Hebrew tradition, Jewish tradition, and Christian tradition, and Taoism. Like the succinct chapter in the Tao Te Ching, return is the motion of the Tao. Yielding is the way of the activity of the Tao. Yielding is the activity of the Tao. 10,000 things are born from being. Being is born from non-being. That very succinct but tightly packed chapter. So we've been talking about return. It kind of begs the question, return to what? Return from what? And we've touched upon that, but the next step is to kind of dig down deep into what the nature of these questions are. What are we returning to? And from whence are we returning? And in spiritual traditions, especially in the Jewish tradition, there's this notion of exile and returning to the land that, Aliyah is to return to the land, to ascend to Israel for the Jewish people, and to leave exile and come back. So the notion of exile, we're returning from exile to home, to put it in kind of poetic, generalized terms. We're still not digging down yet, but just the affective tone of the word exile is kind of useful to have in the system. Is that in return, in the activity of return, we're ending our exile. So that's just a little notion to kind of like put into the room, is the notion of exile, is that from which we are returning to our true home. So then today, I want to look at the exile. I want to look at the question of returning from what? and what is the characteristic, what is the nature of this exile, so we can get some purchase on it, and so that the activity of return is not some vague philosophical romantic notion, but something that we can actually practice, and that we have some sense of what is involved in the return. So basically, today is going to be a rather in-depth focus on a Sanskrit term in Buddha Dharma, Prapañca. Today will be kind of less of a Dharma talk and more of a class on explicating Prapañca. And I'm going to refer to the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism, and it's very, very good definition of the term Prapañca. And I've posted that on the Zen Center Facebook page as a resource. So it's very scholarly. It involves a lot of Sanskrit and Pali terminology, some of which we will touch upon, but not spend much time on. But it'll be there to refer to, and having some substantial understanding of Prapañca will be very useful in future Dharma presentations, and very useful in understanding what think not thinking means. Dogen's instruction for Zazen: think not thinking. How do you think not thinking? Non-thinking. This is the essential art of Zazen, he says. So what does that mean, non-thinking, not thinking? An understanding of Prapañca in its subtlety will maybe, I hope, my aspiration is, will give one purchase on actually executing that practice instruction of Dogen's thinking not thinking. So, Prapañca, another term for our exile from true being, Prapañca. And before I open up the dictionary, some of my own thoughts to a more succinct beginning before getting into the details of the dictionary. Now, one of the obvious accessible manifestations of Prapañca is known in Zen as monkey mind. The mind perpetually, incessantly dropping from thought to thought to thought, like a monkey swinging from branch to branch to branch through the trees. But Prapañca is not just monkey mind. Monkey mind is the more obvious gross manifestation of Prapañca, but there are subtle levels to Prapañca as well. Prapañca is the engine that generates a sense of subjectivity. It's the engine that generates the subject-object modality of experience. In particular, it's a subjectivity on autopilot, a program perpetually running in the background of experience. It contextualizes experience in terms of always self-referential thinking, feeling, and experiencing. Am I doing okay? What's in it for me? Do they like me? Do they approve of me? Are they acknowledging me? Am I getting what I deserve? Am I being cheated? That kind of orientation, self-referential orientation, like on autopilot. That's all we know. It's always there, like a software program running in the background. And we don't even know it's happening. We kind of assume this is just reality. But actually, it's a hyper-developed subjectivity, a subjectivity on autopilot. Is one. So it's not just the monkey mind. It's just the way we see things, the way we hear things. Always in terms of self, do I like it? Do I not like it? Et cetera, et cetera. And the definition will go into more detail about that. But this perpetual experiencing of things through a sense of a subjectivity on the threshold of awareness, we kind of have some intuition that it isolates us, and a sense of loneliness and exile is kind of like the subtext of this way of perceiving and experiencing things. It cuts us off from what in Buddha Dharma we call true being, Buddha nature. We're in a narcissistic world, and the myth of narcissism is not what is commonly understood as narcissism in the parlance of our times, to quote the Big Lebowski. The parlance of our times is a narcissist is an egotist, they're vain, they willfully choose to love themselves. But in the myth of Narcissus, he mistakes his reflection in the pool for the beloved other. So it's not a willful self-loving, it's a cognitive error. And so that's our isolation. We mistake our subjectivity for the actual world. And we're barely aware that we're exiled from actual being. So that's one characteristic of Prapañca, is it cuts us off from the medicinal quality of actual phenomena, because we're in a cocoon, we're obscured from it, we're estranged from the life-giving qualities of phenomenal being. Subjectivity in and of itself is not a problem, it's not bad. It is part and parcel of the beauty and wonder of being human. To be aware that we are aware, to know that we know. Without subjectivity, we couldn't write a poem, we couldn't compose a symphony, we couldn't fully appreciate our life. That self-reflective capacity is not in and of itself, is in and of itself an asset. One of the distinctions of being human. It's when it's on autopilot. It's when it's Prapañca, which is, perpetually proliferating, that it creates this sense of being cut off and isolated, where we're estranged from reality. We are spiritually psychotic. We don't have contact with actual being. We're living inside of our own world, our own self-manufactured world. So that's my introduction to the definition. So we're going to go get technical now and really kind of like examine Prapañca in exquisite detail. That's the task for today, is to get a working grasp on this Prapañca, which is the immediately presenting symptom of our suffering. It's right here all the time, and if we learn how to study it and work with it, it will give purchase for practice. So, and today is focused on trying to get a firm grasp on Prapañca. So, in Sanskrit, literally, the word Prapañca etymologically is diffusion, expansion, conceptualization, or conceptual proliferation. So in its root meaning, those are some of the derivations of the root. Diffusion, expansion, conceptualization, or conceptual proliferation. And that last one is the most usable for us. The synonym, the English translation of Prapañca, word to word, most functionally would be conceptual proliferation. To always live in terms of concept. It's very subtle, because we don't realize that we don't have the actual moon, we have a concept of the moon when we look at the moon. That's the subtle level of Prapañca, that that's the ineffable reality of the moon is unavailable to us when we have that autopilot of concept running. This is very subtle, but very palpably veridical through practice, where the moon grabs you and rocks your world when you can stop Prapañca-ing it, if that's to turn it into a verb. So conceptual proliferation, that's the working translation of Prapañca. But the dictionary goes on to say it's the tendency of the process of cognition to proliferate the perspective of the self. I said that Prapañca is the engine of subjectivity. It generates the sense of a self, of a subject. It generates the subject-object modality of experience. So it's the tendency of the process, the tendency of cognition in and of itself is just a tool, but it has a tendency to go on autopilot. The tendency of the process of cognition to proliferate the perspective of the self throughout all of one's sensory experience via the mechanism of concepts. So it's not just monkey mind, it's all of experience. There's a self, there's the moon over there, there's self here. Well, that's Prapañca. Coming to being with the moon as the moon, that's another concept, but it points towards the ineffable aspect of being independent of Prapañca, independent of concept. So I'm going to say that definition one more time. The tendency of the process of cognition to proliferate, to go on autopilot throughout all of one's sensory experience, not just the monkey mind, but just the way we see, the way we taste, the way we hear. Gives rise to a sense of self. Well, that's Prapañca. Via the mechanism of concepts. We have a concept of what traffic on Main Street sounds like. So we don't hear the ineffable wonder of sound. We hear cars. The logos classicus for describing how sensory perception culminates in conceptual proliferation appears in the Pali Madhupindika Sutta. So that's just, so a definition for Prapañca is found in this sutra. That's what all that fancy words mean. As that scripture explains, any living being will be subject to an impersonal causal process of perception, in which consciousness occurs conditioned by an internal sense base and an external sense object. And so here he's just breaking down the Buddhist theory of experience. With an eye organ and an object of sight consciousness arises. That's basic stuff, and that's what he's saying here. Contact among these three brings out sensory impingement or contact, which in turn leads to the sensation of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, Vedana. At this point, however, so that's basic Buddhist psychology of experience, But at this point, however, the sense of ego intrudes, and this process then becomes an intentional one, whereby one feels, one perceives, what one perceives, one thinks about, and when one thinks about, one conceptualizes, allowing oneself to experience sensory objects not as things in themselves, just the arising of the ineffable moon, but as concepts invariably tied to one's own perspective, the perceiving subject. The perceiving subject then becomes the hapless object of an inexorable process of conceptual subjugation. In other words, what one conceptualizes becomes proliferated conceptually. It's on autopilot. We're stuck inside the subject. We're stuck inside the self. Throughout all of one's sensory experience, everything that can be experienced in this world, in the past, present, and future, is now bound together into a labyrinthine network of concepts, all tied to oneself and projected onto the external world as craving, conceit, and wrong views. So craving, thirst, Trishna, that's the second noble truth. It gives rise to suffering. We want something, we don't want something else. We got a subject that evaluates whether it's what we want or not. So that's one of the sufferings produced by Prapañca, is we're caught in the net of craving. Conceit, mana. Now, conceit is not conceited. It's this always being self-referential in one's experience. What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of it? Am I okay? Do they think I'm okay? You know, that's conceit. And the Sanskrit is mana, and if you look up mana, the fundamental conceit is the conceit of I am. That all this thinking produces a sense of self that we take as inherently real, but it's illusory. It's produced by thought. And so just like a mirage is produced by the play of light on the atmosphere when it's disturbed, but there's no water there, a sense of self naturally arises, but its nature is illusory. But since thought produces this sense of self, we make the Descartes error. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That's manas. That's one of the poisons that flow out of Prapañca, is this sense that since cognition is happening, I must therefore be, which is in terms of Buddha Dharma, the fundamental delusion. Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum is Latin for the fundamental delusion of Buddha Dharma, which I find adorable for some reason. I don't know. Descartes' great, you know, but his famous cogito has problems to it. So where am I? Okay. So the labyrinthine network of concepts, all tied to oneself, all self-referential, are projected onto the external world as, craving. This is great, I want it. This is not so good, get it away from me. Conceit. Here I am, baby. I got these qualities. This is my personality. This is how I roll. That's an exaggerated illustration of, I think, therefore I am. The conceit of I am. In wrong views, that things exist inherently, that they're substantial, that they're real, that they're not perpetually changing. It's the basic wrong view. Thus creating bondage to samsara. So within Prapañca is an inherent restlessness. Samsara means constantly spinning. The mundane whirl is the usual one English translation of the meaning of the word samsara. It's the world of suffering. It's always trying to reify what is essentially unreal. Reify means to make real. It's a philosophical term for to make something more real than it should be. So in Prapañca, we've got the solution of self that we don't want to admit is an illusion. And so we're constantly trying to prop it up, to reinforce it, to convince ourselves, yeah, I'm here, I'm okay, I'm okay, you're okay. And so that is samsara. That is inherently a restless proposition, because there's no there, and you're craving there to be a there. You're wanting to establish yourself, but there's nothing upon which to establish yourself. And so within this sense of subjectivity, this sense of exile, there's a perpetual restlessness. The wandering Jew, that name of a plant comes from the Jewish people being in perpetual exile. Well, not perpetual, but for a long time. Within Prapañca, there's perpetual exile, constantly trying to reify what is inherently unreal. I gotta find myself. I gotta make something of myself. So that's samsara, that perpetual whirling, perpetual spinning is the etymology of the world. In practice, in Buddhist doctrine, it's the world of suffering. It's where we suffer, it's how we suffer. Now, so that's the presentation of Prapañca in this dictionary, the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism. Then he goes on to say, by systematic attention to the impersonal character of sensory experience, by systematic attention to the impersonal character of sensory experience, and through sensory restraint. So this is rather convoluted verbiage. I'll say it once again. By systematic attention to the impersonal character of sensory experience. Now think of Dogen. Genjo koan. When you ride in a boat and watch the shore, you might assume the shore is moving. But when you keep your eyes closely on the boat, you will see that the boat moves. Similarly, if you examine myriad things with a confused body and mind, you might suppose your mind and nature are permanent. But, because Prapañca is running amok, because a confused body and mind, you're letting that autopilot run. But when you practice intimately and return to where you are, return to the arising of consciousness in the here and now, consciousness in its arising, perception in its arising, phenomena in their arising, it will be clear that nothing at all has unchanging self. So that's the same thing. By systematic attention to the impersonal character, the unchanging self character, the non-unchanging self character of sensory experience, and through sensory restraint, saying no to distractions, saying no to the enticements, saying no to the revulsions, and staying present. This tendency to project ego throughout the entirety of perceptual process is brought to an end. It will become clear that nothing at all has unchanging self. In this state of conceptual non-proliferation, perception is freed from concepts tinged by this proliferating tendency, allowing one to see things of this world as impersonal, causal products that are inevitably permanent. Suffering and non-self, the three marks of existence. So impermanent, nothing at all has unchanging self. Suffering, if you try to make them real, if you try to make them unchanging, if you try to reify the inherently unreal, you suffer. And non-self, there's no there. There's just the ever-changing flow of creation that never stops. Those are the three marks of existence: impermanent, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and non-self, anatman. And so when you practice intimately and return to where you are, you'll see the actual three marks of existence. Expressed in the via negativa, in kind of negative terms. There's also positive ways of expressing it, which is not today's topic. The preceding interpretation reflects the specific denotation of the term as explicated in polyscriptural materials. In Mahayana context, Prapañca may also connote elaboration or superimposition, especially in the sense of a fanciful, imagined, or superfluous quality that is mistakenly projected onto an object, resulting in its being misperceived. Such projections are described as manifestations of ignorance. Reality, and the mind that perceives reality, are described as being free from Prapañca. And the purpose of Buddhist practice, in one sense, can be described as the recognition and elimination of Prapañca in order to see reality clearly and directly. Now, I want to say that again. Such projections are described as manifestations of ignorance, the superimposition, the idea of the moon superimposed on top of the ineffable moon. Especially in the sense of a fanciful, imagined, or superfluous quality that is mistakenly projected onto an object, resulting in its being misperceived. Such projections are described as manifestations of ignorance. Reality and the mind that perceives reality are described as being free from Prapañca. And this is the part to underscore and listen carefully. And the purpose of Buddhist practice, in one sense, can be described as a recognition and elimination of Prapañca in order to see reality clearly and directly. Okay, I don't quite agree with that. I don't think it's like we eliminate Prapañca. It's more like we create an opening. We turn off the autopilot so that we can, kind of like part the curtain. And I was thinking this morning, like some sort of space alien, and they got this membrane they're covered with, and they poke through it, and they're kind of like peeking out of it. So that's the practice, is to kind of like make a break in Prapañca so that being as it is, independent of Prapañca, can flow into awareness. Uh, and I've told this tale before of a Tibetan meditation teacher who never taught, a Tibetan Lama who never taught meditation. You know, his group would come and they'd chant together, and they would study maybe Lam Rim or something together, the graduate path to enlightenment, and they have a session of sitting, of meditation, but he never instructed. And one day his student said, you know, Reverend one, why don't you ever teach us some instruction on meditation? Said, oh, you want some instruction on meditation? Okay. You know that gap between one thought and the next thought? Yeah. Make that gap wider. So here's that gesture again of the alien peeking through the membrane. Create a gap in Prapañca. And experience what's to be experienced in the gap. It's a subtle, gentle effort to just interrupt the autopilot, interrupt the ceaseless propagation of Prapañca, of this generation of a sense of I am, of the subjectivity, of the subject-object mode of being that can be turned off. A gap can be created in it. And when that gap is created, the main thing is to feel the ontological shift. It's a different modality of being. It's a different modality of awareness from the subject-object modality, which we take for granted as the reality. But it's not. It's not bad, it's not wrong, although Buddhist sources tend to label it as delusion, as wrong. I think we have to update that. It's just, like Reb Zalman Schachter Shlomi says, the ego is a good manager. It's a lousy boss, but a good manager. The ego has kept me sane, he says, and it's helped me, pay my taxes and all those things. But, it has its limitations. It doesn't nurture our spirit. It doesn't renew our earth for us, but authentic being does. And so the practice is simply to create a little caesura, that's a musical term for a break, a little gap in the flow of Prapañca, and experience what's there to be experienced. Now, if you try to grab onto it, you're creating a concept of arrival, which is more Prapañca. And so by trying to grab onto it, you obscure it. So it's a very gentle, subtle effort to create a gap. And gently, but not obsessively and not forcefully, try to widen the gap. Try to increase the amount of time you are in that realm of being. That's good. And that can be cultivated. It can't be a goal to attain here and now in this moment because it might be elusive, but over time, the capacity to be aware of that modality of being grows. And that's the most important point, is to experience the shift, the quality shift, the ontological shift, where phenomena lack inherent self. They lack comprehension on some fundamental level. Yeah, there's the concepts we apply to them, but in their own being, they're empty. The Heart Sutra teaches us. In their own being, they're mysterious. They're the wonder of being. And those are words, but words that are trying to express some quality of this shift that I'm talking about. And so there's a supplemental resource for this practice of, the dictionary says to eliminate Prapañca, but I propose that not to eliminate, but to create a gap, a little space, to turn off the autopilot so we experience what it's like to be free of Prapañca for a time. And the practice is described in Zen Mind Beginner's Mind, the section called Emptiness, the last paragraph where he talks about concentration. I've referred to this many times. It's my favorite meditation instruction. He says concentration is not to try hard to watch something. In Zazen, if you try to look at one spot, you'll be tired in about 5 minutes. This is not concentration. Concentration means freedom. So your effort should be directed at nothing. You should be concentrated on nothing. If you're concentrated on something, that's more Prapañca, that's more concept. But you're trying to create a gap and say, what is it? A space, an empty space. In Zazen practice, we say your mind should be concentrated on your breathing. But the way to keep your mind on your breathing is to forget all about yourself and just sit and feel your breathing. Forget this perpetual self-referential way of experiencing. How often do we sit and think about our breathing as we're counting our breathing? Well, there's number one. Yeah, I'm doing it, aren't I? Yeah, sure I am. There's number two. It's kind of in the belly, there's number three. There's my diet. All these ideas about the breathing, but to create an empty space where the actual phenomenal experience of the breath, independent of words, is the awareness. That is what awareness is, just the breathing. Independent of concept, independent of a sense of self, just the breathing coming into being. It's, that alien poking through the membrane and taking a look outside of this sense of self. Forget about yourself and just sit and feel your breathing. If you're concentrated on your breathing, you will forget yourself. That's a way to cease Prapañca. Give over yourself to the experience of breath. Surrender yourself. Yield yourself to the experience of the breath in its irreducible, ineffable fullness of what the breath feels like, what the experience of breathing is, without the obscuring screen of self-referential, am I doing it right? Or other kinds of thoughts about it. If you're concentrated on your breathing, you will forget yourself. Prapañca will cease in that moment. If you forget about yourself, you'll feel your breathing. You'll be concentrated on your breathing. So that's an illustration of a practice to take a break from Prapañca. Forget about yourself and just experience the breath. Forget about yourself and just taste your tea, independent of thinking about it. This turn, return, turn, they're related, and then when I was talking about return, that teshuva in Hebrew just means to turn around. So it's a simple turn from Prapañca, from perpetual self-referential thinking and feeling and experiencing, to dropping subjectivity, emptying yourself to be just an empty space within which experience arises. It's a simple, kind of subtle turn. There's not a whole lot that can be said about it. It can only be done. And it's in the doing of it. It's in learning how to do that turn, and Dogen describes this turn in Genjo Koan, to carry yourself forward, a sense of subject, and experience myriad things is delusion. That's Prapañca. That's the subtle level of Prapañca. Monkey mind is the gross level, quite obvious, thought. The subtle level is there's always an I am going forward to experience the moon, the sound of traffic on Main Street. To carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. That the myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. So exact same thing, that subtle turn away from the autopilot of manufacturing a sense of self and just letting creation happen, brand spanking new in this moment. No referent of concept of past or future. It's just, wow, this ineffable wonder of being arising now. It's a subtle turn, but but with gentle perseverance, a little gap can occur. And if you're attentive and your awareness is acute, you can feel the shift caused by that little gap. If you try to grab onto it, that's Prapañca. That's craving, that's Trishna, the second noble truth. And you're going to want to. You're going to want to grab onto it because one of the positive characteristics of phenomena in their own being is inherent bliss, the wonder of being, and that's going to stimulate Prapañca. So that's part of the subtlety of the work. You create this little gap and you get a glimmer, and there's a tendency to grab on, which is running in the opposite direction. So back to Suzuki Roshi. If you are concentrated on your breathing, you will forget yourself. And if you forget yourself, you will be concentrated on your breathing. I do not know which is first. So actually, there is no need to try too hard to be concentrated on your breathing. It's a subtle practice. If you get too headstrong, you miss it. Just try to the best of your ability, gently, perseverant, try to create a little gap in that perpetual autopilot, self-referential modality. Try to drop it for a little bit. Just, forget about yourself and feel your breathing. You don't need to try too hard. It's not quantity, it's the shift. Experience the shift. And then nurture that shift with gentleness and a lack of overbearing control. That won't work, but honor it, cherish it, love it, respect it. You can't have it, but through an act of grace, you are it and you can realize it. So just do as much as you can. And now the kicker sentence: if you continue this practice, eventually you will experience the true existence, which comes from emptiness. So if you continue this practice, and there's actually an illustration, I think it's from medieval Renaissance times, of a guy peeking out from the cosmos as understood in the medieval era, and then he looks and there's this phenomenal thing that he could never have imagined. He peeks his head outside of the sphere. So it's that alien peeking through the membrane. If you continue this practice, eventually you'll experience the shift of being, the true existence which comes from emptiness, which is ineffable. So I can't F it. I can't speak it in an adequate way. It's practice. You have to experience it. But that's a long commentary on this last bit of the definition. The goal, that the purpose of Buddhist practice, in one sense, can be described as the recognition and elimination. Taking a break from autopilot, creating a little gap in Prapañca, in order to see reality clearly and directly. If you continue this practice, eventually you will experience the true existence which comes from emptiness. So that's going to be basically it for today. So Prapañca, like I say, the definition I posted on the Facebook page. I got 2/3 of the way through it, I think, today. I don't know if I'll need to go back to the definition again. We'll see. But Prapañca, this engine of perpetual creation of subjectivity, this perpetual experiencing things in a self-referential way in thought, emotion, and experience. We mistake it for the way things ultimately are, like Narcissus did. And the practice is to that's our exile. Prapañca is what we are returning from. And when we start to be, when we study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self, Dogen said. So we study Prapañca. Oh, yeah, we study how it's, its nature, which is a tendency to to proliferate, and a tendency to flip onto autopilot, tendency to mistake that for how things ultimately actually are. Narcissus again. And if we study it closely, we can see that it creates a sense of separation, the self and other. And in that inherent subject object self other separation, there's a sense of estrangement, of exile. If we look at it closely, the tendency to always need to prop up the self, to process experience in terms of, am I doing okay? Do they like me? Am I fucking up again? That within that tendency, that creates an exile, that creates an isolation, where we're not open to the fullness of being. We're always evaluating, where we are in context with what's happening, and there's a perpetual restlessness involved in that, always having to prop it up, always having to justify it, to reaffirm it. The restless reification of the inherently unreal is the verbiage that I came up with in one of my writings. It's a way to describe one aspect of it. The restless reification. The word reification is a philosophical term for making real something, making more real something which isn't as real as you want it to be. So you reify something, you make it more real than it should be. So within Prapañca, when you study it closely, you will observe on one part of it is this restlessness, this samsara, this constant on the move to prop it up, to justify it, to establish it. And shorthand verbiage for that is the restless reification of the inherently unreal. That's what's happening in Prapañca. That's the suffering side of it. And so the practice of return is to create that little gap. Just try to make a little space. Feel your breath. Feel your spine. Feel the weight of your butt on the cushion. Hear the sounds. And just gently forget about self-preoccupation, forget about yourself, and just receive what is arising in awareness, fresh and new, here, now, this moment. Practice intimately to return to where you are. And observe the quality of being that gap in always generating yourself creates. When you create that gap in the self-preoccupation, study what that experience is like. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. Look at Prapañca, acknowledge it's happening. To study the self is to forget the self. Create that little gap. What is think not thinking like? What is being beyond self preoccupation like? To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. You come to life as the moon, and it's inevitable, but that's, to be actualized by, when you forget the self, you're actualized by the sound. You are the sound on Main Street. There's no gap, no separation. Exile is over. And then Dogen goes on to say other things that right now would just obscure it, but let's review that as another way of looking at this return process. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. Look at how you're always generating a sense of self on gross and subtle levels. Feel the restlessness of that, how tiresome it is to always have to worry about yourself. To study the self is to forget the self. Well, what's beyond that? Poke your head out from above Prapañca and try to create that little gap. Forget about yourself and just sit and feel your breathing. What can you feel a shift in the nature of your experience of phenomena? What does that feel like? Dogen gives a clue. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. Can you experience how you come into being with phenomena as the phenomena, that there's no gap, no separation. So that's a shorthand way of this work, that passage from Genjo Koan. So that's it for this morning. I really want to encourage you to look at that definition. It's very scholarly. It's got the verbiage is somewhat ornate, but understanding the Prapañca as deeply as you can could be a really good resource and give you purchase on the quality of effort that think not thinking. What is not thinking? It's beyond thinking. What is the nature of that effort? What is the nature of popping your head up above the film of self to experience the true existence which comes from emptiness? Prapañca is a very key term to resource for the practice of all of this. Next on our agenda will be to look a little bit more closely at the nature of home. I think we've talked about return from what. Next on the agenda is to return to what, to explicate that a little bit. Impossible though it is. May our intention equally extend to every being and place with the true merit of Buddha's way. Beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to become it.